Hello and welcome to my video for GCSE Citizenship Studies, and the subject of this particular video is whether the UK is a diverse nation or not. Right then, so my previous videos have focused on spending a little time looking at the idea of both the concept of citizenship and Great Britain. For example, we looked at the four nation states that make up Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So it's about time that we look at the people who make up the UK, and we're going to do this over a couple of videos. So we're going to look in this video at migration, and in the next video we're going to have a little look at multiculturalism. Okay, so I think that the first thing I ought to do is give a bit of a warning. When we talk about migration, and especially immigration, it's very easy to have passionate views about the subject. Politicians on the left and right have got into an awful lot of trouble for expressing views about migration. Famously, Gordon Brown, the ex-Prime Minister, described a woman as being bigoted for questioning him about immigration. Unfortunately for Gordon Brown, he spoke to the woman, gave her a bit of a chat about his thoughts, got into the car, didn't realise that the microphone was still on, and called her a bigot. She was a lifelong Labour supporter, and he was forced to apologise, and it looked particularly bad. I suppose the biggest problem about this subject is that it's very easy to refer to someone as being racist if they don't hold views that are similar to your own. And I just want to advise against that. You've got to be careful when using terms such as this. I see that, see it sometimes in written essays that such and such is a racist. I've got to say that people can legitimately oppose immigration for a number of reasons. For example, you might be worried about the impact on healthcare in the area that you live. With more and more immigrants coming into the area, is the healthcare or education system or all the other public services that these people use, is that going to be sufficient? Will there be enough for people who've lived in the community for a long time, etc.? Now, you don't have to agree with them, but it doesn't mean that they don't have a point of view. And it doesn't mean to say that you can accuse them of being racist when they aren't, and when they're just making a legitimate sort of concern. So I just want to warn against that. Equally, I would also say that where racism does take place, then people obviously ought to clearly state that people are holding racist views and that those views are unacceptable. Okay, so a bit of a history about migration. If you listen to some far-right commentators, you would think that the UK has always been an English-speaking country populated by white people. And I think it's fair to say that this couldn't be further from the truth. Our history is undoubtedly one of migration, both to and from this country. So some of the questions that might arise from this topic is, why do you think people are prejudiced towards migrants? What do you think they dislike about them? And also you might want to expand your language skills by researching the words, or a word such as xenophobia. Now, I'm not going to go into a full history of migration. I mean, you could, but we can look at migration over a couple of thousand years. I think one of the earliest examples that seems to be in the citizenship syllabus is the Roman Conquest of Britain. And that basically introduced people from across the Roman Empire, including North Africa. We could also see sort of migration a little bit later with the Vikings. And the Vikings colonised places in the East Midlands and the northeast of England, and in doing so gave them their names. So as an example of this, if you live in a city, town or village with a name that ends in Toft, Thorpe or B, such as Grimsby, then the chances are that it was named by Vikings. If it has Magna or Parva, then that's a Latin derivation for big and small. And equally, if you live on the Isle of Sheppey, that's Old English for Sheep Island. So you can see at least three different influences just on the place names that we have around the UK. I guess the next big change in society was the Norman Conquest of 1066, and that added yet another dimension. It added the introduction of French words to Anglo-Saxon, which was a Germanic language. Basically, it means that English has far more words than French. So if you've ever sat there complaining that French is a difficult subject to master, it's more difficult if you're French trying to master English. For example, cow is Anglo-Saxon, but beef is French. Sheep is Anglo-Saxon, whereas mutton is French. And that's fairly unusual. That was basically introduced by the French because rich people wanted to use the French, poor people continued to use the Anglo-Saxon, and eventually we ended up with words which described both the animal and the animal in its kind of cooked state. The other thing that I should say, swear words. Swear words are often referred to as Anglo-Saxon language. And that might be the case in some instances, but it isn't always true. For example, the F word, I guess you might know what that is Germanic, as is the word skitter, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Maybe I'm not. Maybe it's pronounced shitter, which means diarrhea. You don't have to be an expert in Anglo-Saxon to guess what word it becomes. However, other words are clearly French. I won't, but you can look those up yourself. Right then, so I'm coming into the 20th century now, and following World War II, migration to Britain came from countries in the Commonwealth. Migrants were invited basically to the UK to assist with post-war rebuilding efforts. One of the most famous examples is a ship called the Empire Windrush. Now, the Empire Windrush landed in Britain in 1948 from the Caribbean. Why have we heard about that? Well, recently in 2018, a scandal emerged in which basically the Home Office was accused of deporting immigrants who were illegally entitled to remain in the UK. So just a bit of a backdrop to this all. The Commonwealth is basically a collection of countries that were previously part of the British Empire. Now, most of these countries are now independent. Some continue to have the Queen as their head of state. However, what they've done is they've joined what I would say is as a formal organisation called the Commonwealth, of which the Queen is the kind of head, if you like, or used to be the head. I think she might have resigned from it now. I'm not sure. I'll have to research that. But basically, after World War II, Britain needed to be rebuilt. We didn't have the manpower, so we invited people from the Commonwealth to come to the UK to assist in that rebuilding effort. Again, we see more recent examples of immigration to the UK. So in the 1970s, the Ugandan dictator Idi Amin expelled 27,000 Southeast Asians from Uganda. As Commonwealth citizens, many came to the UK to rebuild their lives. They had the right to come to this country to do so. And as with other immigrants, these new citizens of the UK chose to live in cities where there were existing communities, cheaper housing and jobs. And many of these were in large urban areas such as London, Manchester, Birmingham, etc. So again, you see that kind of disproportionate level of migration in places such as London, whereas if you went to, I don't know, rural Gloucestershire, you might not see so much examples of migration to the UK. One of the big questions that people have, and I guess that this looks at things like multiculturalism and has it worked or failed, is that in recent years, many people have questioned about how these groups have assimilated themselves into UK society. In other words, have they remained a distinct and separate group, or have they tried to kind of blend in with the rest of society? And I guess when we look at that, you might argue that some groups have done it better than others. Okay, in more recent years, and basically until Brexit, membership of the European Union allowed free travel and the rights of residency for UK and EU citizens. What that means is that if you were a UK citizen, because we were members of the European Union, and you wanted to live in Spain, you could go and live in Spain. Or if you wanted to go and live in France, you could go and live in France. Equally, that led to migration to the UK from countries such as Poland and Romania. Now, that has sometimes, again, be seen as somewhat controversial. For many, this sort of, Brexit is seen as a disaster, which has resulted in thousands of low-paid jobs needing to be filled with lots of UK citizens basically not wanting to do those jobs. In contrast, supporters of Brexit would argue that we should only be welcoming well-paid, highly skilled and educated migrants. Again, quite a controversial issue. You might want to argue from sort of two different points of view. Should say that Britain's exit from the EU now means that freedom of movement has ended, and that EU citizens who wanted to remain in the UK have had to apply for the right to remain in the UK, and equally people from Britain living in the EU have also had to apply to remain in the countries where perhaps they're living. So one of the final things that we could argue is, well, what are migrants done for us? It's the kind of thing that you get from, as I say, those right-wing commentators that I spoke about right at the beginning. And I think it's fair to say that this country without migration would be a very different place. The language you speak, spoke about how migration has changed the English language, to the food and drink you consume. I should say that Yorkshire tea does not come from Yorkshire. The music you listen to, almost all of these things has been shaped by migration. You can even look at some of the UK's biggest companies. Tesco's was started by the son of Jewish migrants in the East End of London. Marks and Spencer, again, one half of Marks and Spencer, when that was created, was a Jewish migrant. So I would argue that this is a good time to start looking at phrases such as multiculturalism. It's also maybe the starting point about thinking about how your own day-to-day experience has been impacted for migration. So, for example, it would be really unusual to attend a school in which every student was white. So I think there's plenty of things to look at, and in my next video we'll start to unpack some of those things by looking at Britain as a multicultural society.